Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking that whole framework we've built up, the myths, the art, Baisugen, Da Vinci, Pirosmani.
All those complex figures and stories.
Exactly. And we're trying to ground it, like really ground it in, well, cold, hard science.
That's the plan. We want to show this isn't just a poetic analogy. It's about how minds actually work, or sometimes how they don't work when faced with complexity.
Right. So the mission today is to move past the poetry, past the metaphors, and find the actual, like, testable cognitive laws behind why some communication succeeds and some just crashes and burns.
We're making the hard connection, essentially. We're looking at the specific science, the papers, the theories that explain this phenomenon of receiving or failing to receive, what we've been calling prismatic sfumato.
That complex, layered truth.
Okay.
And the core question, the thing we really want to unpack for you listening is why? Why does one person hear something complex and grow, while another hears the same thing and just rejects it, sometimes violently?
And we're arguing it's usually not about the message itself being flawed. It's about the receiver. It's about their mental setup, their processing capacity.
So it's less about stubbornness and more about cognitive architecture.
Precisely. We need to dive into the science that defines this success and failure. And maybe start with the failure part. What happens when a mind hits that wall?
Okay, let's unpack that. The failure. The sources are pretty clear. It's not seen as just being pig-headed or morally stubborn. It's described as a predictable processing bottleneck, like a system limitation.
Exactly. That's crucial. Think about Sushien's initial shock when he sees Bai Sushin's true form, that broken bridge moment. It's not just emotional shock. It's a cognitive failure rooted in, well, two key concepts, cognitive load and schema theory.
Okay. Cognitive load. That's like how much information your brain can handle at once.
Pretty much. And the brain is fundamentally a resource manager. It's built for efficiency. It can't analyze every single piece of data from scratch every second. That would be overwhelming.
So it takes shortcuts.
Right. And those shortcuts are schemas. This idea comes from work by people like David Rummelhart back in the 80s. Schemas are these mental frameworks, like file folders in your head. They hold generalized knowledge about concepts, situations, people, how the world usually works. They let us process familiar stuff really quickly.
So Yuzhen, he had a schema for a wife, and probably a very separate schema for Snake Demon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very separate, very rigid. In his world, those two folders absolutely did not overlap. They couldn't.
That sounds efficient for, everyday life. But why does that efficiency become a problem, a pathology even, when something complex comes along?
Because when new information arrives that fundamentally contradicts the existing schema, and it's complex, high-load information, the system jams. It stalls.
Okay.
And the brain, faced with this mismatch, this incongruity, basically has two options. The first, the default, is assimilation.
Assimilation. That's like cramming the square peg into the round hole. Yeah. Forcing the data to fit.
That's a perfect way to put it. The brain tries to save energy. It takes this new, complex, prismatic sfumato data by being both wife and spirit and healer, and tries to force it into one of its existing, but totally inadequate schemas.
So Zhu Qian tries to force her into the monster box because it's the only one that seems remotely applicable, even though it's wrong.
Precisely. It leads to distortion. He loses the complexity, the truth of who she is, to maintain his existing worldview. He keeps his comfort, but sacrifices reality. That's why complex truths often get pathologized or simplified into something negative.
He twists it until it fits. Okay, so what's the alternative? The harder path.
The harder path, the one that allows for actual growth, is accommodation. This isn't forcing, it's changing.
Ah, so you changed the mental folder itself.
Yes, you have to abandon or significantly modify the old rigid schema, and you have to actively build a new, more complex, higher-order schema that can actually hold the contradictory elements, like creating a new folder labeled Loving Wife, who is also a powerful ancient spirit.
That sounds difficult, like a lot of mental work.
It is difficult. It's cognitively expensive. It requires mental energy, effort, and often involves sitting with discomfort.
And that discomfort, that psychological stress of holding two opposing ideas at once, that's cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. Leon Festinger's work from the 50s. When Zhujian has the belief, I love my wife, right next to the belief, my wife is a snake demon, an existential threat, the tension is massive.
Yeah.
The mind instinctively wants to reduce that dissonance, that discomfort. And assimilation, just deciding she's purely a monster, is the quickest, easiest way out. It resolves the tension, but falsely.
Whereas accommodation means you have to live in that painful contradiction for a while until you can build that new, more complex understanding.
Yes, you tolerate the dissonance while the cognitive restructuring happens.
Okay, this is fascinating because the sources really emphasize that the kind of information we're talking about buys identity, Da Vinci's coded notes, this prismatic sfumato stuff. It has a cognitive load that is specifically designed almost to exceed the capacity of a simple, rigid schema.
It's an overload event. It's not just slightly confusing. It's reality-breaking for that rigid mind.
And the mind doesn't just sit there confused, it crashes.
It crashes.
Yeah.
The breakdown isn't random. It's a predictable psychological crisis. We can even see parallels in neurobiology, specifically in threat responses. Think about the freeze response. Joseph Ledoux wrote about this.
The deer in the headlights.
Exactly that. When the amygdala, the brain's threat detector, encounters information that so fundamentally violates its safety assumptions about how the world works, it can trigger a shutdown.
So the cognitive system just freezes. It can't compute the input.
Right. It's an ontological shock. The data doesn't fit any existing safe category.
Hmm.
So Zhu and collapsing when he sees Bai's true form, that's not just melodrama. It's a plausible depiction of a cognitive system in crisis, overloaded by schema-shattering input.
Wow. Okay, this directly connects to those mental architecture metaphors we use.
Okay.
The flat table mind versus the hyperbolic tessellation.
Yes. The flat table mind has those rigid schemas. It can only handle information that fits neatly into its existing flat categories, like items placed separately on a table.
But the hyperbolic tessellation, that sounds more complex.
Think about geometry. Flat, Euclidean geometry is straightforward. Parallel lines never meet. But hyperbolic geometry deals with curved space. It allows for infinite, intricate patterns tessellations to exist on a curved surface where our usual rules don't quite apply.
Okay.
Conceptually, a mind capable of hyperbolic tessellation can hold complex, seemingly contradictory truths that curve back on themselves. It can contain multitudes. It can accept wife and snake and healer, all tessellated together into one complex identity without the system breaking.
So the broken bridge isn't just emotional distance. It's literally the failure of a complex hyperbolic message trying to load onto a simple flat table processor.
It's an architectural mismatch, a communication breakdown rooted in incompatible cognitive systems. The message requires a type of computation the receiver simply isn't equipped for initially. It's measurable, predictable, and cognitive. Okay, so if the failure is predictable and cognitive, then the success must also be understandable in those terms. This means we need to shift our focus away from just blaming the message and instead look at the receiver's capacity.
Right. We need to diagnose what allows someone to process that complex message successfully.
And the key variable, the measurable trait, is what psychologists call cognitive flexibility. This is essentially the scientific term for what we've been calling the prismatic mind.
I like that. It takes it out of the realm of just, oh, be more open-minded and into something quantifiable. So how is cognitive flexibility defined scientifically, beyond just being adaptable?
It's defined as the mental ability to switch between different concepts, to adapt your thinking when faced with new or unexpected situations, and, crucially, to shift your focus or behavior as demands change.
Okay.
And work by researchers like Tiku Ionescu back in 2012 really explored how this flexibility is deeply linked to the ability to tolerate and work with ambiguity and contradiction. That's the core of it.
So it's not just about, say, adapting if your commute changes. It's about being able to hold two conflicting ideas in your head simultaneously, like, my wife is human and my wife is a spirit, and not shutting down, being able to function with that complexity.
That's exactly it. That ability to tolerate the cognitive stress that comes from ambiguity from the sfumato is essential. If you can't handle that stress, you'll default back to assimilation, back to simplifying and distorting. Ionescu's work shows this flexibility is key for complex problem solving because it lets you break free from old, potentially unhelpful thought patterns.
And the amazing thing is scientists can actually measure this. We're not just guessing who's flexible and who's rigid.
No, we're not guessing. This is where the work of Dennis and van der Waal in 2010 is so important. They developed and validated the Cognitive Flexibility Inventory, or CFI.
CFI, okay.
It's a psychometric tool, basically a self-report questionnaire, that allows researchers to get a reliable measure of a person's capacity for this kind of adaptive thinking. It's like a ruler we can use to measure the prismatic quality of a mind.
Let's make this concrete for listeners. If someone scores low on this CFI, what does that actually look like in their day-to-day life? Is it just about big philosophical ideas?
Oh no, it manifests very practically. Someone with a low CFI score tends to rely heavily on established routines and rules. They might feel genuine distress if things change unexpectedly, like if the grocery store rearranges the aisles or if a planned event suddenly shifts. They prefer certainty.
Hmm.
So when it comes to complex intellectual or emotional information that challenges their existing categories, that preference for certainty translates into a quick, almost fear-based rejection of novelty or contradiction. They struggle with nonlinear information, which is exactly what Suzhin embodied and what Da Vinci often presented.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So this gives us a really clear, testable hypothesis connecting our whole framework back to measurable science.
Absolutely. The prediction is straightforward. Individuals who score significantly lower on the cognitive flexibility inventory should be demonstrably more likely to reject, distort, remember assimilation, or pathologize complex, ambiguous information.
Whether that information is in art or politics or personal identity.
Exactly. Compared to those who score high on the CFI, who should be better able to accommodate and integrate that same complex information.
This really reframes those historical tragedies we talked about, like with Da Vinci or Pirosmani. It's not just that they were ahead of their time in some vague sense.
Right. We can hypothesize that their contemporary audiences, or at least the gatekeepers, likely suffered from a sort of aggregate deficit in cognitive flexibility, specifically concerning the type of complexity those artists were introducing.
So with Da Vinci, it wasn't just pretty drawings of muscles. He was challenging centuries of established medical dogma, the Galenic schemas.
Exactly. His contemporaries, steeped in scholastic tradition, their minds weren't flexible enough to accommodate data that overturned everything they thought they knew about the human body.
Yeah.
They saw a threat to their entire worldview, not just an interesting anatomical observation.
So the mirror script,
Mm.
it wasn't just for secrecy. It was maybe a conscious act by someone who knew his audience couldn't handle the raw data.
It certainly suggests an awareness of the receiver's limitations. He was perhaps tragically aware that the signal, if too clear, would be rejected or destroyed by minds not flexible enough to receive it. He was packaging disruptive ideas for low-flexibility processors.
And Pirosmani, the self-taught Georgian painter whose work was dismissed by the formal art world.
Same principle, different field. The art establishment had a rigid schema. Real art requires formal training and adherence to academic technique. Pirosmani's work, full of raw truth and intuitive genius but lacking that formal polish, didn't fit their schema.
Their minds lacked the flexibility to accommodate the idea that profound artistic truth could exist outside their narrow rules.
Their flat table minds couldn't process the hyperbolic truth he was putting on the canvas. They saw primitive, not profound. It's a classic case of schema rigidity, leading to the rejection of genuine, complex value.
Okay, so to really get this, we also need to understand where information is stored in the mind. Our framework uses that metaphor of the internal and external libraries, and you're saying this actually maps onto real, scientifically recognized memory systems.
It does quite nicely. It aligns well with dual process theory and the distinction cognitive science makes between different kinds of memory, particularly implicit versus explicit memory.
All right, let's start with the internal library. We linked this to Suzhin's innate wisdom or Pirosmani's intuitive way of painting. What system does that correspond to?
That aligns very well with non-declarative memory, which is often called implicit memory.
Implicit memory. What defines that?
Work by researchers like Larry Squire has really detailed this. Implicit memory is essentially the knowing how. It's the knowledge we have that we don't necessarily consciously access or verbalize.
Like skills, habits.
Exactly. Skills like riding a bike, habits, procedural memory, classical conditioning, priming effects. It's all in there. It's knowledge gained through experience, often unconsciously, and expressed through performance, rather than conscious recall.
So by Suzhin's ability to just know how to conjure rain or heal or understand nature's flow, that's her tapping into this vast, ancient internal library built on millennia of experience. It's implicit. It's the territory itself, not just a map of it.
Beautifully put, it's non-conscious embodied wisdom. Now contrast that with the external library. This is where we place Xu relying on his medical texts or Da Vinci doing his meticulous rule-based studies.
Okay, so what does that map onto?
That maps very clearly onto declarative memory or explicit memory.
Explicit memory. That's the stuff we can consciously recall, right? Facts and events.
Precisely. Endeltelving's work broke this down further into semantic memory, which is your general knowledge, facts, concepts, the meaning of words, basically textbook knowledge, and episodic memory, which is your memory for specific events and personal experiences.
So this is the knowing that. the map, not the territory.
Exactly. Yushina's world initially is almost entirely built on his external library. He knows the rules of medicine, the social conventions, the logic he was taught. His schema failure happens because the implicit truth of his wife, her internal library reality, crashes against his rigid, rule-bound, explicit knowledge systems, his external library.
The two libraries are in conflict, and his system can't bridge them.
Not initially, no. Which brings us to a crucial psychological trait that acts like a gatekeeper, determining whether complex, ambiguous data even gets considered seriously in the first place.
Okay, what's that?
It's the tolerance for ambiguity. This is basically the Sfumato principle, the acceptance of blurred lines applied to the receiver's psychology.
Tolerance for ambiguity.
This concept, pioneered by Els Frenkel Brunswick, among others, suggests that people differ in their basic ability to handle uncertainty, complexity, and situations where things aren't black and white.
So if you have low tolerance for ambiguity,
Your cognitive system almost preemptively shuts down or rejects information that doesn't fit into neat, clear-cut categories. You find ambiguity itself stressful, maybe even threatening.
it's not just that you dislike fuzzy situations, you perceive them as dangerous.
Cognitively dangerous, yes. A review by Furnham and Ribchester back in '95 pulled together a lot of evidence showing that low tolerance for ambiguity is strongly linked to a high need for cognitive closure, wanting quick, definite answers, and a reliance on rigid, black-and-white thinking.
Because black and white feels safer, more certain than living in the gray areas.
Exactly. It reduces that uncomfortable feeling of dissonance much faster.
That explains so much about Xu Shan's initial reaction. When he's distressed, the monk Fahai comes along offering a simple, absolute black and white explanation. Snake is evil, wife is illusion, separate yourself.
Fahai offers the ultimate cognitive shortcut back to the flat table. No ambiguity, no complexity, just a simple, albeit destructive certainty. It's alluring because it promises to instantly resolve the unbearable ambiguity Xu Shan is facing.
Whereas Bai requires him to do the hard work to live in the sumato, the uncertainty, the contradiction, until he can build that bigger, more complex understanding.
Precisely. To embrace the prismatic mind, you first need a sufficient tolerance for ambiguity. You have to be willing to endure the discomfort of uncertainty while you do the cognitive work of accommodation. This is the price of admission.
Okay, so if the failure is this cognitive crash, this schema breakdown, then the success, the transformation, like Shuzhen going from the broken bridge to building the medicine shop with Bai, that whole journey has to be seen as more than just a plot device. It's a real psychological, maybe even neurobiological achievement.
Absolutely. It's a system upgrade, forced by crisis. And science gives us ways to conceptualize and even measure that upgrade. One key concept here is integrative complexity.
Integrative complexity. Okay, what does that measure?
It's about how people structure their thinking. Researchers like Sudfeld, Tetlock, and Streufert have done a lot of work on this. It measures the ability to differentiate and then integrate multiple perspectives or dimensions of an issue.
So it's not just about knowing lots of facts, but about seeing the connections, the nuances, the relationships between different, even conflicting pieces of information.
That's exactly it. Someone with low integrative complexity think the flat table mind tends to see things in simple dichotomous terms, good or bad, right or wrong, us or them, black and white.
Mm-hmm.
But someone with high integrative complexity, the prismatic mind, can recognize multiple valid viewpoints. They can see trade-offs, understand interactions, hold contradictory ideas in tension, and synthesize them into a more nuanced, comprehensive understanding. They see the shades of gray, the complexity.
So Zhujian developing the understanding that Bai's spirit nature isn't separate from, but actually intrinsic to her power as a healer and her love for him, that's an increase in his integrative complexity.
Definitely. He moves beyond the simple wife or snake dichotomy to a higher order wife and spirit and healer integration.
And the medicine shop they build together, it's not just a nice symbol of their marriage working out. It's like the physical manifestation of his upgraded cognitive system.
It really is. It represents the successful integration. His explicit external library knowledge, medicine, is now working synergistically with her implicit internal library wisdom, spirit power, intuition. He didn't just go back to his old way of thinking. He built a new, more complex operational model that incorporates the previously disruptive information.
A model that can handle more complex realities.
Exactly. But achieving that required going through immense stress and pain. The ontological shock wasn't trivial. And that leads us directly to another important psychological concept, post-traumatic growth, or PTG.
PTG. I've heard of this. It's the idea that people can actually grow and become stronger because of trauma, not just in spite of it.
That's the core idea, yeah. Work by people like Tedeschi and Calhoun has shown that struggling with major life crises and discovering your wife as a powerful ancient spirit certainly qualifies, can lead to positive psychological changes.
It's not just bouncing back to where you were before, it's bouncing forward.
Precisely. PTG isn't about resilience in the sense of returning to baseline. It's about achieving a level of psychological functioning, wisdom, or appreciation for life that is actually higher than before the trauma occurred.
So the crisis itself, the schema failure, becomes the catalyst for building a stronger, more complex, more capable cognitive system.
The intense pressure forces the accommodation that might not have happened otherwise. The old system was inadequate, the crisis proved it, and the struggle to survive that crisis forced the construction of new mental pathways, new schemas.
Zhu Xian doesn't just forgive Bai or accept her. He fundamentally reconstructs his understanding of reality around her complex existence.
Yes. And the medicine shop, this new equilibrium where human knowledge and spirit power collaborate for a greater good, is the tangible outcome of that growth. It's proof that his system didn't just repair, it upgraded. It achieved higher integrative complexity as a result of successfully navigating the trauma through accommodation. That's the successful arc of curved learning. The shock forces you onto a steeper path, but the destination is a higher level of understanding.
What's really striking when you lay out all this science is how universal this pattern seems. We're using the Bai-Susan myth, but you could apply this model of cognitive struggle, failure, and potential growth to so many areas, like scientific revolutions.
Absolutely. Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions is, in many ways, a perfect macro-level case study of this entire cognitive framework playing out within the scientific community.
Okay, let's map it. Kuhn talks about normal science within a dominant paradigm. That paradigm.
Yeah?
That's like the collective, shared, rigid schema, right? The flat table for that scientific field.
Exactly. Think Ptolemaic astronomy, the Earth-centric model. That was the established schema for centuries. Everyone operated within it. That's normal science.
Then anomalies start cropping up, data points that don't quite fit the model. That's the high cognitive load information challenging the schema.
Right. And initially, the flat table mind tries to assimilate. They add patches, adjustments, like adding more epicycles to the Ptolemaic model to try and make the planetary movements fit. They force the data.
But that gets increasingly complex and unsatisfying. It creates collective cognitive dissonance.
Precisely. Researchers start feeling the strain. The old model isn't working well, but the alternative is too radical to contemplate easily.
Until finally there's a paradigm shift, a revolution. That's the moment of accommodation, when the community finally builds the new, more complex schema, the hyperbolic tessellation needed for the heliocentric model, for instance.
Yes. And the resistance to that shift, the fierce defense of the old paradigm, isn't just about scientific disagreement on data. It's often about collective low cognitive flexibility. It's about the psychological difficulty of abandoning deeply ingrained schemas.
So the established figures who resist the new paradigm, they're like the Fahais of science, clinging to the old certainty.
In a cognitive sense, yes. Their identities, their careers are often built on the old schema. Accommodating the new disruptive data requires dismantling their own internal libraries, facing uncertainty. It's neurobiologically demanding, and many resist. It shows the Bai-Shu-Xian dynamic isn't just myth, it's a fundamental pattern of knowledge disruption and reception.
Okay, so this really solidifies the model. We've effectively translated this framework into testable science. We have the variables.
We do. We can operationalize it. First, you have the independent variable, the information itself. How complex is it? Is it simple, flat table data, or is it complex, ambiguous, hyperbolic, prismatic tessellation data? We can vary and measure the stimulus complexity.
Then the dependent variable, DV, the outcome in the receiver. What happens? Do they show signs of acceptance and integration, maybe measured by an increase in integrative complexity after exposure? Or do they show rejection and breakdown, high cognitive dissonance, schema defense, maybe even physiological stress responses?
And crucially, the key moderating variable, the receiver's baseline cognitive flexibility, which we can measure beforehand using something like the CFI.
And the prediction is that cognitive flexibility determines how the IV affects the DV. High flexibility allows integration of complex 4Vs. Low flexibility leads to rejection.
That's the core hypothesis derived from integrating the narrative and the science.
So, if we look back at our key figures through this scientific lens, we can almost rank them based on their awareness of this whole dynamic, especially the crucial role of the receiver, the receiver's responsibility to cultivate that prismatic mind.
There seems to be a clear hierarchy, yes. At one end, you have the perhaps unconscious or naive senders.
Yeah.
Pirasamani seems like pure, unmediated expression, probably little thought given to how his audience would process it. And maybe Baisujan, initially at least, operated more on faith that her true self, if revealed, could be accepted without fully grasping the immense cognitive leap required from Jushian.
She underestimated the receiver's necessary work.
Potentially, yes. Her failure wasn't in her truth, but perhaps in not understanding the mechanism of reception in a standard human mind.
Then who's more aware? Da Vinci.
Da Vinci seems tragically aware. He wasn't naive. He seemed to understand, maybe cynically, that the profound cross-disciplinary hyperbolic tessellation insights he had were just incompatible with the cognitive flexibility of most people around him.
So the codes, the mirror writing, deliberate defenses against predictable rejection.
It strongly suggests that. He knew the signal was too complex, too paradigm-shattering for the average flat-table receiver. If presented clearly, it might be dismissed, attacked, or destroyed. His awareness was of the audience's deficit. His work became a kind of time capsule waiting for more flexible minds.
Okay. And what about Quinger, the green snake? Where does she fit?
Quinger represents, maybe, the pragmatic and furious awareness. Her anger at Jian's initial failure isn't just loyalty to Bai, it's fury at the failure of reception itself.
Ah, she sees a valuable, life-giving signal hitting a wall of cognitive rigidity.
Exactly. Her rage is the understandable frustration of seeing truth rejected out of fear and inflexibility. It mirrors the frustration Da Vinci must have felt. It's the indignation when a receiver refuses to do their part, refuses to build their half of the bridge, which leaves Yuxian himself. Yuxian is the ultimate figure here. He's the successful receiver. He's the only one in this core story who actually goes through the entire painful process. He takes the trauma, the ontological shock, and uses it to consciously, painstakingly transform his own cognitive architecture. He develops the prismatic mind.
He embodies the entire model, the crash, the dissonance, the struggle, the accommodation, the growth.
He is the living proof of concept. He chose the difficult path of growth over the easy path of denial. He fulfilled what the framework suggests is the receiver's fundamental, almost sacred responsibility. The medicine shop isn't just by his achievement, it's his cognitive achievement made manifest.
So, the core argument, scientifically grounded now, is, yes, the sender needs to offer truth with integrity. But the critical burden, the responsibility for successful communication of complexity, lies with the receiver cultivating a prismatic mind.
If you, the receiver, want to understand the deep, complex truths of the world, whether in science, art, relationships, whatever you have, to be willing to upgrade your own mental architecture, the transformation requires the receiver's evolution.
The entire journey of curved learning hinges on the receiver's willingness to embrace that cognitive flexibility, tolerate ambiguity, and do the work of accommodation. #outro. So let's try and wrap up this incredibly dense deep dive. What we've seen is that the story of how profound, complex ideas are communicated and received, from ancient myths right up to cutting-edge science, is really the story of the receiver's mind evolving.
Yeah, the sources, the science we've looked at, it proves that accepting complex truth isn't just a matter of choice or opinion. It's a demanding psychological process. It's a measurable cognitive achievement.
That medicine of truth, the prismatic sfumato, it's always being offered, isn't it? By figures like Bai, Da Vinci, Pirasamani, by challenging artists, scientists, thinkers.
It's always on the shelf, so to speak. But the science is telling us that medicine only actually works. It only gets integrated when the receiver actively works to become the prism. When they develop the internal complexity needed to diffract that light into a richer, higher understanding.
We've seen there are tools like the cognitive flexibility inventory to measure our capacity for this, and concepts like integrative complexity to track the success of that integration. We understand the failure modes, schema, rigidity, assimilation, cognitive overload, and the success modes, accommodation, post-traumatic growth, synthesis.
We have the map now, the cognitive map of transformation.
Which leads us to the final thought, the provocative bit for you to take away. Remember Quinger's anger at Zhu Jin's initial failure. Now that we have the scientific map, her anger feels, well, justified, doesn't it? It's the fury of seeing a potentially life-changing signal hit that rigid, unprepared wall.
Right. And if we know that our own cognitive flexibility, our tolerance for ambiguity, our integrative complexity is the key variable determining whether we can receive the next complex, challenging, maybe even world-changing truth.
Then the question becomes personal. How can you, listening right now, consciously work to increase your own cognitive flexibility? What steps can you take starting today to ensure that when the next prismatic sfumato signal arrives, and you're not the simple lens that distorts or rejects it?
How do you become the prism, ready to receive and be transformed?
Something to think about. Dive deep, embrace the necessary discomfort of growth, and keep building that prismatic mind. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
Welcome to the debate. We are opening up the source material today to address, well, one of the really profound challenges in understanding complex truth. It's this phenomenon we sometimes call prismatic sfumato, that moment when a message, full of ambiguity, contradiction, just the full spectrum of reality, it lands not as enlightenment, but as a catastrophic failure of communication.
Yeah, and this is crucial, I think, because we're trying to map the scientific and maybe strategic responsibility for that failure. When that complex truth kind of breaks down the relationship or the whole system, where do we, assign the blame? Is the communication bridge broken because the sender maybe presented the light improperly, or is it because the structure on the receiving end was just fundamentally too rigid to bear that kind of load?
Precisely. So our central question today really revolves around responsibility. Does the success of complex, ambiguous communication hinge primarily on the receiver's capacity to tolerate contradiction, which means the painful but maybe necessary development of what the sources call the prismatic mind, or does it hinge more on the sender's strategic choices in encoding and transmitting that message?
And I'll be arguing that the sender's role in sort of contextualizing this complex truth is often neglected, and this leads to an immediate, sometimes unfair, and yes, sometimes catastrophic burden on the receiver. I think the sender has a kind of duty of care towards what might be a fragile recipient system.
And I'll be taking the position that the ultimate, I'd even say sacred responsibility rests with the receiver to develop that necessary capacity. The transformation required to actually integrate complex truth is fundamentally an internal, even neurobiological achievement, and therefore, it's solely the receiver's duty to undertake it.
Okay, a fascinating division of labor indeed. Let's maybe start with the mechanics of the failure itself.
Right. So my core position is that this communication crisis, that broken bridge moment, is scientifically defined primarily as a failure of reception, not transmission. And to really get this, we have to look at the characters, especially Su Xian in his early state. He acts like a simple lens, not a prism. He's rigid, right? Dependent on very simple binary categories.
The man of textbooks, you could almost say.
Exactly. So when the message, this prismatic sfumato, hits him, it's data that is both schema incongruent, doesn't fit his existing mental model, and it carries a cripplingly high cognitive load. Think about the truth that his beloved wife, Bai Su-zhen, is also this incredibly powerful non-human entity. The mind, when faced with that kind of overwhelming contradiction, it just exceeds the capacity of that rigid schema, and this leads to a pretty predictable system crash or freeze response, which is, well documented in cognitive processing models.
Okay, but you're focusing entirely there on the internal breakdown, aren't you?
Well, yes, because I'm focusing on what I see as the crucial variable for success, which is internal. It hinges on this measurable psychological trait, cognitive flexibility, and that's defined precisely as the capacity to tolerate and work with ambiguity and contradiction. That capacity is the definition of the prismatic mind. So the receiver's journey, it's a necessary, often painful evolution culminating in what researchers call higher integrative complexity. And this is symbolized perfectly by Zhu Xian eventually building the medicine shop. The sender provides the light, maybe pure, necessary light, but the receiver must provide the prism to successfully integrate that spectrum.
Okay, I do acknowledge the strength of that scientific mapping you're presenting. I mean, the forging of the prismatic mind must ultimately happen within the receiver. It's clearly an internal achievement. However, I guess I come at it from a different angle. The catastrophic nature of the failure often feels avoidable, and therefore I think the sender holds a pretty profound responsibility to mitigate the shock caused by their maybe naive or ill-suited modes of transmission.
But how can the pure truth be ill-suited? Isn't truth just truth?
Well, because the sender's often operating under a perhaps crucial, maybe even arrogant assumption That truth is self-evident and requires no preparatory encoding. If you look at the source material concerning Bai Sujen, it explicitly details her sender's naivety. She operated perfectly within her own internal reality, but she failed completely to grasp the actual mechanism of reception required for a simple human like Shuzhen to integrate her spectral identity. So the failure isn't just the simple lens breaking, it's perhaps the sender ignoring the existence of the simple lens entirely.
But if the truth is diluted or simplified, doesn't it cease to be prismatic sfumato? Doesn't it lose its transformative power?
Well, the source gives us a counterexample in Da Vinci, doesn't it? He understood his reality, his complex insights, but he was also tragically aware that his audience, his contemporaries, were not prismatic. And this awareness forced him to encode his, let's call it, full spectrum transmission in mirror script and in private sealed notebooks. This really demonstrates that the sender's strategic choice, or sometimes a lack of thereof, like with Bai's raw expression or maybe Pirosmani's unconscious artistic outpouring, that choice really determines the immediate reception, regardless of the receiver's future potential. So I think focusing solely on the receiver's need for capacity neglects the sender's really profound duty to contextualize their truth with some strategic integrity.
Okay, that brings us, I think, directly to our first major point of contention, the scientific mapping of the failure itself. If the crisis is fundamentally about the internal system, as I argue, then the breakdown is rooted in cognitive dissonance. The complex truth that Suxian loves his wife and that she is, from his perspective, a monster. It just fundamentally exceeds the computational capacity of his rigid schema.
I see why you'd frame it that way, purely as a computational deficiency. But let's maybe step back and look at how the source depicts the information flow itself. We have the sender's internal library, Bai's intuitive, magical, complex wisdom. And then we have the receiver's external library, Suxian's very rigid, rule-based knowledge from his textbooks.
And the clash seems inevitable there.
The clash is inevitable, yes, but I question whether the devastation has to be. The sender can't just, dump raw data from their internal library onto a receiver who is entirely reliant on their external library and then sort of claim zero responsibility for the system crash that follows. I mean, communication theory itself shows that efficacy depends heavily on encoding a message that actually accounts for the channel and the expected noise. Bai's sender's naivety here is a failure to manage that noise. The established dogmas, the societal expectations, Fahai's influence, and, yes, the limitations of Shushan's current mental hardware.
Well, I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning because the core problem still feels like the rigidity of the schema, which is fundamentally internal to the receiver. The sender cannot possibly be responsible for, upgrading the receiver's mental operating system. If you argue the sender must accommodate the simple lens, aren't you essentially arguing for withholding complex truth?
I'm arguing for the mediation of complex truth, perhaps. The sender has to choose a channel, an encoding, that's suitable for the current capacity of the receiver. If I have a super high-definition, incredibly complex signal, the prismatic sfumato, but I know the receiver only has, say, an old analog antenna, the simple lens, then sending the full, raw signal immediately just guarantees failure, doesn't it? Da Vinci understood this necessity of waiting or encoding. Why must we assign the failure solely to the victim of the information overload?
That question, I think, shifts us nicely into our second core disagreement. This idea of the transformative journey versus the immediate context. You use Da Vinci to suggest the sender must wait, potentially for centuries, for humanity to collectively develop the prismatic mind. That seems to place an almost unbearable strategic limitation on transmitting complex knowledge when it might be needed most.
Absolutely, I think it does. Zucian's transformation itself is evidence that the burden of required learning is placed disproportionately on the receiver. The sender, who's already operating at a high level of integrative complexity, they really must acknowledge the often low aggregate cognitive flexibility of their contemporary audience. This isn't about diluting the truth necessarily, it's about respecting the limits of the channel.
the very fact that Da Vinci had to wait centuries suggests that the immediate context, the widespread lack of prismatic minds, is a profound limitation the sender has to grapple with.
That's a compelling argument, especially regarding the cost of lost time, I grant you that. But have you considered that if the sender always waits for the optimal context, complex truth might never be transmitted when it is most critically needed? I mean, the successful journey, the path from the broken bridge to the medicine shop, it maps almost directly onto psychological models of post-traumatic growth. This positive psychological change happens as a direct result of struggling with crisis, struggling with the overwhelming force of the prismatic sfumato.
So, are you advocating for ontological shock as some kind of pedagogical tool?
I'm arguing it's often a necessary crucible for transformation. If the sender simplifies the message too much, or censors it, like Da Vinci did, effectively for centuries, to spare the receiver the crisis, they might actually rob the receiver of the painful yet absolutely essential impetus for transformation. The receiver's willingness or eventual willingness to tolerate ambiguity is the necessary precondition for forging that prismatic mind. The crisis, the breakdown itself, maybe that's the pressure required to turn the simple lens into a functioning prism.
But doesn't that potentially make the sender ethically compromised? Knowingly inflicting potentially severe psychological trauma when they could perhaps choose a safer encoding? If the sender knows their signal is likely to trigger a system crash, a computational failure, as you put it, it starts to feel like an intentional act of destruction rather than just pure transmission.
I see it differently. The sender's duty, arguably, is to present the true light, the full spectrum. The receiver's duty is to evolve to meet it. The trauma isn't inflicted by the sender, necessarily. It's the reaction of the simple lens attempting to process a spectrum it's fundamentally unprepared for. So the trauma is perhaps an internal failure of structure, not an external failure of intent.
That places a heroic, maybe even an impossible, burden solely on the individual receiver, doesn't it?
Well, maybe it's the defining feature of profound learning. Let's look at the archetypes that define the successful outcome. My final point really centers on Zhu Xian himself. He, as the successful receiver, actively chose to accept the full spectrum of Bai's nature. And he built a new life schema, symbolized by the medicine shop, that could actually contain her complexity. This shift from simple binary thinking to a nuanced, prismatic view, that seems to be the sole variable determining success in this narrative structure.
That's an interesting point, though. I might frame it slightly differently. Okay, the sender, Bai, she was a constant, complex pattern, right? The receiver, Zhu Xian, had to become the kind of consciousness that could process that pattern. I agree this required active duty on his part, definitely. But we absolutely must look at Quinger. She acts as the crucial interface, almost the manifestation of the immense effort required on the sender side to achieve that miracle.
But surely Quinger is just Bai's agent, ensuring the message gets a fair hearing.
I see her as much more. Quinger is like the highly sophisticated AI translating between systems. She understands both the raw internal library of the spirit world and the, frankly, cynical, rigid external library of human society. Her role as a translator, the negotiator, the facilitator, it highlights that the sender's camp often requires this complex external system just to compensate for the simple lens's failure. This doesn't look like the receiver fulfilling their sacred duty organically. It looks like the sender's agent facilitating a very difficult, heavily assisted passage.
Quinger guides, certainly, but she cannot force the necessary cognitive leap. That has to come from within Zhu Xian.
I come at it from a different way, though. If the sender's truth is simply too raw, too much like Pirosmani's pure, unmediated instinct or Bao's overwhelming raw identity, they force the use of a costly, complex interface like Quinger. The very reliance on Quinger indicates a kind of transmission failure that requires massive corrective action from the sender's side just to make the bridge passable. The sheer necessity of Quinger's role, for me, shows that the burden placed on Tushan was so unreasonable initially that the sender's camp bears significant responsibility for bridging that cognitive gap.
But if the receiver ultimately refuses to activate their own prismatic mind, refuses to make that leap, then all of Quinger's efforts are, well, nullified. The final decision, the final act of integrating the complexity, it still belongs solely to the receiver.
And yet, if the sender transmits in a mode practically designed to cause a crash, forcing the receiver to endure severe trauma simply to begin the process, then perhaps they fail in their strategic duty to ensure efficacy, to ensure the message even has a chance to land.
So, in summary, my position remains that the scientific evidence points quite strongly to the receiver's capacity, that cognitive flexibility, the prismatic mind, as the key variable in successful integration. The transformation is internal, it's arduous, and it seems fundamentally necessary. The ultimate, let's call it, sacred responsibility rests with the receiver to upgrade their own system, to achieve that higher integrative complexity. Only then can the medicine, the complex truth, finally be integrated into their reality. The sender provides the raw, essential light, yes, but the creation of the prism feels like a solo neurobiological endeavor.
And I would reiterate that the sender's mode of transmission, whether it's through naivety, like Bai, or through tragic self-censorship, like Da Vinci, often places an unreasonable initial burden on the receiver. So while the receiver must eventually transform, I maintain the sender holds a profound moral and strategic responsibility to minimize that initial failure, that ontological shock, and to help manage the path toward developing that prismatic capacity. We really have to account for Quenger's justified anger that such a beautiful, life-giving truth was met with unnecessary rejection, partly due to a failure of strategic transmission.
And so the debate continues. It certainly illuminates that while the light of truth might need to be pure, the ability to actually see the full spectrum depends just as much on the existence of that light as it does on the strategic readiness of the prism.
Indeed, there is clearly much more to explore in the scientific mapping of these complex, resonant mythologies onto the very architecture of the human mind.